In the sun-blasted centuries before written history settled over Greece, there existed a memory so powerful that it outlived the civilization that created it. That memory was war, a 10-year siege against a wealthy city on the coast of Anatolia, fought by a coalition of Greek kingdoms against the people of Troy. We know this war through Homer, through fragments of lost epics, through the excavated dirt of a mound in modern Turkey called Hisarlik. Separating myth from history is nearly impossible because the two were never separate to begin with. The Greeks who told this story were not writing history in our sense. They were preserving something older and stranger, a folk memory of a real Bronze Age conflict, dressed in the armor of gods and heroes. To understand the Trojan War, we have to hold both truths at once, the poetry and the pottery, the myth and the mud. Let's begin with the world that made this war possible. Around 1250 BCE, the Aegean was dominated by a civilization we call Mycenaean Greece, named for its greatest citadel, Mycenae, in the Peloponnese. These were not the democratic Greeks of Athens centuries later. They were warlords ruling from massive stone palaces, controlling trade networks that stretched from Egypt to the Baltic. They wrote in a script called Linear B, used almost exclusively for tracking grain, tribute, and weapons. They were rich, militaristic, and competitive with one another, a patchwork of rival kings rather than a unified nation. Across the Aegean Sea, on the northwestern coast of Anatolia, sat Troy, known to archaeologists as Hisarlik. Troy was not Greek. It sat at the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow watergate connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. Every ship moving grain, timber, and metal between these two worlds had to pass within sight of Troy's walls. This gave the city enormous leverage. Whoever controlled Troy controlled the toll booth of the ancient world. Archaeology shows a city of real wealth, thick fortified walls, a citadel on a hill, evidence of trade goods from across the Near East. Troy was not a myth. It was a strategic prize, and prizes like that attract enemies. Now to the myth's version of causes, because it tells us something true, even in its fantasy. The story begins with a wedding, that of the sea nymph Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, parents-to-be of Achilles. All the gods were invited except Eris, the goddess of discord, who arrived anyway and tossed a golden apple into the feast inscribed, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Zeus, unwilling to judge a contest he could not win gracefully, handed the decision to a mortal, a Trojan prince named Paris, tending sheep on Mount Ida. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera offered power, dominion over men. Athena offered wisdom and mastery in war. Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, young and mortal and unwise, chose Aphrodite. And the most beautiful woman alive was Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Strip away the divine machinery, and this myth is doing real cultural work. It's explaining, in the language of legend, something the Greeks themselves seemed to sense: that the war began over the abduction, or elopement, of a high-status woman, and that this act was really a proxy for something larger, an insult to honor, a violation of guest right, a spark that ignited older tensions between trading rivals. Whether Helen existed at all is unknowable. What matters is what she represented in the story, a breach of the sacred laws of hospitality that Bronze Age aristocrats considered nearly as important as the gods themselves. Before Helen married Menelaus, myth tells us, Every king in Greece had courted her, because she was famous even as a young woman for her beauty. Her stepfather, Tyndareus, fearing violence between the suitors, made them all swear a binding oath. Whoever won Helen's hand, the rest would defend that marriage against any man who tried to steal her away. This oath, the oath of the suitors, is the mechanism by which a private insult to one Spartan king becomes a war involving every kingdom in Greece. When Paris took Helen to Troy, either by seduction or outright abduction, Menelaus didn't just lose a wife. He invoked an oath that bound the entire Greek aristocracy to his cause. Menelaus turned to his older brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece. Agamemnon began assembling the coalition. Nestor, the elderly king of Pylos, lent his wisdom and diplomacy. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, famously tried to dodge the draft by feigning madness, plowing his fields and sowing them with salt, before he was tricked into revealing his sanity. Ajax of Salamis brought his size and brute strength. And there was Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph. Thetis, prophesied to be the greatest warrior of his generation, hidden by his mother on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl, to keep him from the war she knew would kill him. Odysseus found him there too, the story says, by laying out weapons among gifts of jewelry and watching which the disguised prince reached for instinctively. By the time the fleet gathered at Aulis, Homer's catalogue of ships in the Iliad lists contingents from nearly every corner of the Greek world. A coalition of roughly 29 contingents, over 1,000 ships in the poetic tally, though the real number was almost certainly far smaller. This catalogue is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the tale preserves genuine Bronze Age geography. Many of the kingdoms named were real Mycenaean centers, some of which archaeology confirms were abandoned or destroyed by the era's end. Before the fleet could sail, myth says the winds died. Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis, and the fleet sat becalmed at Aulis until he agreed to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease her. Whether she died on the altar or was spirited away by the goddess at the last moment depends on which version you follow, but the story marks Agamemnon from the very beginning as a man willing to trade his family's blood for military glory, a character flaw that will return with interest when he finally comes home. So the fleet crossed the Aegean, and here myth and archaeology start to genuinely converge, because the destruction layer at Hisarlik, known as Troy Sephene, shows a city that was burned, its walls breached, its streets littered with the debris of violent, sudden destruction, dated to roughly 1180 BCE, consistent with the twilight of Mycenaean power. This doesn't prove Homer's plot, but it proves something happened. A city at that critical strait was destroyed by force at approximately the right time. The siege itself, according to the epic tradition, most of it not from the Iliad itself, which covers only a few weeks in the war's final year, but from later poems now lost to us, except in summary, the so-called epic cycle, lasted 10 years. 10 years is almost certainly poetic exaggeration, a number meaning a very long time rather than a literal decade. But ancient sieges could genuinely stretch for years given Bronze Age logistics. No siege engines capable of breaching a well-built Bronze Age wall existed yet, so armies mostly starved cities out or waited for treachery from within. The Iliad opens in the war's 10th year with a crisis that has nothing to do with Troy's walls and everything to do with Greek pride. Agamemnon has seized a captive woman, Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. When her father prays for vengeance, Apollo sends a plague through the Greek camp. To end it, Agamemnon must return her, but he compensates himself by seizing Briseis, a captive woman already claimed by Achilles as his war prize. This is the insult that drives the entire plot. Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, withdraws from battle in fury, and without him, the Greek army begins to collapse under Trojan pressure, led by Hector, Troy's greatest prince and defender. What follows is not a war story in the modern sense, but a meditation on rage, honor, mortality, and the terrible arithmetic of glory. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, borrows his armor and leads the Myrmidons into battle to save the faltering Greeks, only to be killed by Hector in single combat. This is the hinge of the entire epic. Achilles' grief transforms into an almost inhuman fury. He returns to battle, slaughters Trojans in staggering numbers, fights even the river god Scamander when the corpses choke his waters, and finally corners Hector outside Troy's walls. Hector, knowing he will likely die, chooses to stand and fight rather than flee, and Achilles kills him, then drags his body behind his chariot in a desecration that shocks even the gods watching from Olympus. The Iliad ends not with the fall of Troy, but with an act of grace. King Priam, Hector's father, sneaks into the Greek camp under divine protection and begs Achilles for his son's corpse. Achilles, moved to tears by a grief that mirrors his own, returns the body. It's a startlingly human, almost anti-heroic ending for a war epic. The poem cares less about who wins than about what war does to the people trapped inside it. The rest of the war's events come to us through other, mostly lost poems, later summarized by ancient scholars, and through tragedy and later retellings. Achilles himself dies before Troy falls, shot in most versions by Paris with an arrow guided by Apollo to the one vulnerable spot on his body, his heel, the point his mother held when she dipped him in the river Styx as an infant to make him immortal. Ajax and Odysseus recover his body, and when the Greeks award his magical armor to Odysseus instead of Ajax, Ajax's wounded pride drives him to madness and eventual suicide. One of the many stories showing that these heroes were never meant to be simple role models, but complicated, flawed men undone by the same pride that made them great. The war's actual ending comes through cunning rather than valor. A prophecy said Troy could not fall without the bow of Heracles, wielded by the wounded archer Philoctetes, abandoned on an island years earlier. He's retrieved and healed. Another said Troy needed the presence of Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. Odysseus and Diomedes sneak into Troy itself to steal a sacred statue, the Palladium, said to protect the city while it remained inside the walls. And finally comes the trick that made this war famous above nearly every other conflict in human memory: the Trojan Horse. Odysseus devised it. A massive wooden horse, hollow, built ostensibly as an offering to Athena. The Greek fleet pretended to sail away in defeat, leaving the horse on the beach along with a single man. Sinon, who convinced the Trojans the horse was sacred and that burning or damaging it would bring divine punishment. Despite the warnings of the priest Laocoon, who hurled a spear into its side and was then killed by serpents sent from the sea, and the prophetess Cassandra, cursed to always speak true prophecy and never be believed, the Trojans dragged the horse inside their walls and celebrated their apparent victory. That night, Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse emerged, opened the gates for the returning fleet, and Troy was destroyed in a single catastrophic night of fire and slaughter. The sack of Troy, as later poets and playwrights tell it, was merciless. King Priam was killed at his own household altar. His infant grandson, Astyanax, Hector's son, was thrown from the city walls to prevent any future claim to the throne. The women of the royal house, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, were divided among the victorious Greek commanders as slaves, their grief immortalized centuries later in Athenian tragedy, particularly by Euripides, who used the fall of Troy to interrogate the morality of war itself, at a time when Athens was engaged in its own brutal conflicts. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and kinsman of the royal house, escaped the destruction. And in Roman mythology, that escape becomes the seed of an entirely new civilization, as Virgil's Aeneid claims Aeneas's descendants eventually founded Rome. The fall of one city in the mythic imagination becomes the origin of another empire entirely. But victory did not bring peace to the Greeks either. The Odyssey tells us Odysseus wandered for 10 more years before reaching home, battling monsters, gods, and his own crew's foolishness. A journey often read as a metaphor for how impossible it was for any soldier to simply return to normal life after 10 years of war. Agamemnon fared far worse. He returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, in vengeance for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia years earlier. The war's opening crime finally repaid. Menelaus and Helen, oddly, are said to have reconciled and lived out peaceful years back in Sparta. The woman at the center of it all, fading quietly out of the narrative once the killing stops. Historically, what we can say is more modest, but still remarkable. The late Bronze Age Aegean, around 1200 to 1150 BCE, collapsed catastrophically. Nearly every major Mycenaean palace was destroyed within a few generations, part of the wider late Bronze Age collapse that also toppled the Hittite Empire, of which Troy may have been a vassal or ally, and battered Egypt under invasions from the mysterious Sea Peoples. Troy the Seventh's destruction fits into this general era of chaos, whether or not it was caused by a Greek coalition specifically. Hittite records mention a place called Welusa, likely Troy, and a group called the Ahiawa, very likely the Achaeans, Homer's word for the Greeks, suggesting some real, if smaller scale, conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian powers around this region and era. What Homer, composing his epic centuries later around 750 BCE, inherited was not a documentary record, but a distant memory reshaped by oral tradition, real place names and real geopolitical tensions fused with generations of storytelling, exaggeration, and religious meaning-making. The 10-year siege of one city by a grand coalition was likely, in truth, a smaller, messier series of raids, trade wars, and coastal conflicts common throughout this era, remembered and mythologized into a single, unforgettable epic. The war's true legacy isn't a battlefield outcome. It's cultural. It gave the Greeks a shared origin story that transcended their fractured city-states, a common heritage that later Greeks pointed to for identity even while fighting each other. It gave Western literature its first great meditation on rage, mortality, and the cost of glory. It gave us archetypes that never faded: the wrath of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, the doomed nobility of Hector, the tragedy of Cassandra and Priam. And it left behind an enduring question the Greeks themselves kept returning to in their tragedies and philosophy: whether any cause, a woman, an oath, a wounded pride, is ever truly worth 10 years of fire and a generation of the dead.